The sun dipped behind the Santa Monica hills, painting the California sky in strokes of orange and violet. From the cliffs overlooking the Pacific, a sprawling glass and steel mansion caught the last light, glowing like a temple of wealth. This was the residence of Richard Coleman, the man the media often called the architect of the modern American dream. Richard stood on the balcony of his mansion, sipping a 30-year-old scotch, his tailored navy suit catching the golden glow. At 54 he had the posture of someone who never lost, someone who bent the world to his will. His salt and pepper hair was combed back neatly, his square jaw framed by the faintest smile that said, "I know something you don't." The evening news played softly on the flat screen inside the lounge, his face filling the screen as anchors recounted his journey. From a humble upbringing in rural Ohio to building one of Silicon Valley's largest tech empires, Richard Coleman embodies the very essence of the American dream, the anchor declared. The narrative was perfect, almost too perfect. He was a billionaire who had risen from nothing, a visionary entrepreneur whose innovations had reshaped digital security worldwide. Politicians wanted his endorsements, universities sought his donations, and magazines couldn't print enough glossy covers with his sharp profile. But as Richard watched his own highlight reel, there was no warmth in his eyes. Only calculation. Behind him, the sound of footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor. His personal assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Julia Marks, appeared with a folder in her hand. "Tomorrow's agenda," she said, placing it on the glass table. "You've got CNBC at 9, the MIT Foundation call at 11, and the charity gala in the evening. Black tie." Richard nodded, barely glancing at the papers. He thrived on schedules, appearances, control. Every move of his public life was choreographed like a Broadway show. Every word was a note in a symphony of power. As Julia turned to leave, he spoke. "Julia." She paused. "Make sure the speech for tomorrow emphasizes resilience. The markets need to hear it. Investors need to believe I'm unshakable." She gave a curt nod. "Understood." When she left, silence swallowed the room again. Richard walked inside, his gaze landing on a framed black and white photograph hanging above the grand piano. It showed a young Richard, maybe 20 years old, standing in front of an old brick building with the words Ohio State University etched on its facade. His smile back then was unpolished, genuine, the kind that belonged to someone who still believed in simple victories. He stared at the photo for a long moment, then turned away sharply, almost irritated at the reminder. Across town, the media circus was already gearing up for tomorrow's gala. Paparazzi lingered outside the Beverly Hilton, preparing their cameras. Online headlines buzzed with anticipation. Billionaire philanthropist Richard Coleman to host annual tech charity ball. For the world, Richard Coleman was not just a man. He was an idea. A symbol that no matter how deep the odds, you could rise, conquer, and claim the American throne of success. But beneath the marble floors and glittering chandeliers, there were whispers. Rumors that his humble beginnings weren't so humble. That the polished origin story he repeated on late-night talk shows had cracks. For now, those whispers were just that, drowned out by the roar of his empire. Richard poured himself another drink and stepped back onto the balcony. The Pacific stretched before him, infinite and indifferent. He felt a strange shiver crawl up his spine, though the evening air was warm. Something about the silence tonight unsettled him. From below, in the shadows near the front gate, a lone figure watched the mansion. A woman, her features obscured by the brim of a wide hat, lingered for several minutes before disappearing into the night. Inside, Richard raised his glass to the horizon, as if toasting himself. "To the dream," he murmured. Yet for the first time in years the word tasted bitter. The gala's echo still lingered in Michael Harrington's mind long after the last champagne glass had been cleared away and the ballroom chandeliers had dimmed to black. He was back in his penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline, alone now except for the faint hum of the city below. He loosened his tie, poured himself a glass of bourbon, and tried to ignore the gnawing unease in his chest. He had been in this world long enough to recognize when something wasn't right. The speech, the flawless execution of the charity event, the headlines that would paint him as a savior of the underprivileged, it all should have satisfied him. Yet behind the congratulations and flashing cameras, he had caught a glimpse. A face. Someone in the crowd who did not belong. A woman in her 30s, sharp eyes beneath understated glasses, had stood near the back. She hadn't clapped during his speech. She hadn't smiled when the governor praised his generosity. Instead, she had watched him with a focus that cut through the polished facade he wore like armor. Michael could still see her lips moving, whispering something to the man beside her. Then she had vanished before the gala ended. He set the bourbon down untouched. His gut told him this wasn't just a curious guest or a reporter sniffing for a scandal. It was something more dangerous, someone who knew. The knock at his door startled him. He rarely allowed unannounced visits. His security team downstairs was supposed to intercept anyone who tried. Michael approached cautiously, only to find Elena Ramirez, his trusted head of security, standing there. "You saw her too?" she asked without preamble. Michael nodded slowly. "Who was she?" Elena's jaw tightened. "Her name is Claire Donovan. Investigative journalist. She's been digging into old contracts linked to Harrington Global. Off-the-record sources say she believes your first fortune wasn't as immaculate as the world thinks." Michael's chest constricted. 4 years he had buried the truth, locking it away behind layers of lawyers, shell companies, and philanthropic gestures. He wasn't the self-made genius the magazines loved to portray. The empire's first building block had been soaked in someone else's downfall. An oil deal in Texas that destroyed entire families when a local town's water supply was poisoned. His signature was never on the paperwork, but his fingerprints were everywhere. "Elena," he said quietly, "you understand what happens if this resurfaces." "I do," she replied. "The question is, how far are you willing to go to keep it buried?" Michael turned away, staring out at the city lights glittering like scattered diamonds across the night. He thought about his foundation, his hospitals, the scholarships he had endowed. To the world he was a benevolent titan. But if Claire Donovan pulled at the right thread, the entire illusion could collapse. And yet, deep inside, another thought stirred, a dangerous one. Maybe this was inevitable. Maybe someone needed to hold him accountable. The following morning, Michael followed his usual ritual: a 5-mile run along the Hudson, a meeting with his legal advisors, and a visit to his foundation's headquarters. Cameras followed him as always, capturing the polished image of a man too perfect to doubt. But beneath the tailored suit and charming smile, his mind raced. At the office, his assistant handed him a sealed envelope. "This arrived for you. No return address." Inside was a single photograph. It was of him, decades younger, standing beside a drilling site in Texas. The smile on his face looked eerily similar to the one he wore today, but behind him were protesters, families holding signs, children with water bottles marked with black sludge. On the back of the photo was a handwritten note: "The truth has a way of surfacing. CD." Michael's pulse quickened. Claire wasn't just probing. She had evidence. That night, instead of retreating to his penthouse, he drove himself, without security, to a quiet bar in Brooklyn, a place where the elite never went. He sat in the corner booth, nursing a drink, waiting. He didn't know if she would come, but something told him she would. And she did. Claire Donovan slid into the seat across from him, calm and composed, as though she had orchestrated this meeting. Up close, her presence was disarming. Not confrontational, not aggressive, just steady, like someone who had already decided how the story would end. "You're not easy to find without your entourage," she said. Michael managed a thin smile. "And you're not the kind of journalist who hides in the shadows forever. What do you want, Claire?" Her gaze didn't waver. "The truth. The people you hurt deserve it. You can't buy your way out of this one." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Do you have any idea what you're up against? The machine behind me doesn't break. It destroys. Careers. Reputations. Lives." For the first time, Claire's composure faltered slightly. But then she straightened. "Maybe. Or maybe this is the story America needs, the fall of a man who thought he was untouchable." Michael's hand tightened around his glass. He knew then that this wasn't going away. Claire Donovan wasn't after money, wasn't chasing clout, she was after justice. And that made her far more dangerous than any rival billionaire he had ever faced. The city outside roared with life, but in that dimly lit booth, Michael Harrington realized his empire had just entered its most fragile chapter. And this time it wasn't a competitor or a market crash that threatened him. It was a truth he could no longer outrun. Michael Harrington had built his life on control. Markets, boardrooms, politicians, he understood how to bend each one to his will. Yet for the first time in decades he felt something he despised: vulnerability. Claire Donovan was not playing by his rules. She wasn't chasing money and she wasn't intimidated by power. That made her unpredictable, and unpredictability was lethal. He didn't return to his penthouse after their encounter. Instead, he booked a room under a false name at a boutique hotel in Soho, the kind of place where anonymity was valued more than luxury. Elena Ramirez, his head of security, had advised against it, but Michael needed distance. Cameras, staff, even loyal assistants could become liabilities. He sat at the small writing desk, staring at the photograph Claire had sent. That single image carried more weight than all his carefully curated press releases and philanthropic gestures combined. If she published it with the right context, the narrative would shift overnight. America's beloved billionaire would become the villain who poisoned a town for profit. The phone buzzed. It was Elena. "She's not bluffing," Elena said as soon as he answered. "Claire has a file. I don't know what's in it yet, but my source says it's more than photographs. Contracts, testimony, maybe even financial records." Michael's jaw tightened. How close is she to going public? Hard to say. But she's moving carefully. Not the type to leak online for clicks. She'll build a case piece by piece. When she publishes, it'll be airtight. Silence stretched. Michael rubbed his temple, feeling the weight of years of secrets pressing down. "Elena," he said finally, "I want you to make contact. Not to threaten her. To understand her. Find out what she really wants. Everyone has a price." "I'm not sure she does," Elena replied. "But I'll try." Claire Donovan wasn't hard to track. She had a modest apartment in Queens, a cluttered workspace filled with case files, and a reputation for chasing impossible stories. Her colleagues described her as relentless but fair, someone who wouldn't publish unless she could prove every line. Elena knew better than to approach her directly, so she staged it carefully. An accidental run-in at a coffee shop Claire frequented, casual conversation that could pass for coincidence. By the time they exchanged names, Claire's eyes had sharpened. "You work for him," she said, not as a question but as a statement. Elena gave a measured smile. "I do. And I think you and I should talk." Claire stirred her coffee slowly, studying Elena like she might a witness on the stand. "If you're here to scare me off, don't bother. I've had threats before. They don't work." "That's not why I'm here," Elena said. "Michael wants to know what you're after." Claire's laugh was bitter. "What I'm after? I'm after the truth. Tell your boss he doesn't get to buy his way out this time." Elena leaned forward. "And if the truth destroys more than just him? If it takes down his foundation, the hospitals, the scholarships? The kids depending on those programs? Are you ready to burn it all to the ground just to make a point?" Claire hesitated. For a fraction of a second, doubt flickered across her face. But then she set her jaw. The foundation was built on blood money. "Don't talk to me about charity when the seed was corruption." Elena nodded slowly. She had expected this. Still, she filed away the hesitation, because hesitation was leverage. Meanwhile, Michael made his own move. He reached out to an old ally, Senator Thomas Reynolds, a man whose political rise had been quietly fueled by Harrington Global's donations. Over a private dinner at a Georgetown townhouse, Michael laid out the problem. "This journalist thinks she can dismantle everything I've built," Michael said, keeping his voice low. "I need protection. I need her credibility destroyed before she publishes." The senator swirled his wine, thoughtful. "Michael, times have changed. I can't squash a story the way I could 10 years ago. Social media, watchdog groups, it's harder to control the narrative." "Then help me shift it," Michael pressed. "Find her weakness. Everyone has one." Reynolds studied him. "And if she doesn't?" Michael's gaze hardened. "Then I'll create one." Back in Queens, Claire returned to her apartment after a long day of interviews with former residents of the poisoned town. She was exhausted, but her determination burned hotter than ever. Parents had shown her medical records of children who had suffered permanent damage. Widows had described husbands who wasted away from cancers they believed were tied to the contamination. Claire had recorded it all. She was just setting her files down when she noticed something odd. A small red light blinking faintly near the bookshelf. Her chest tightened. It was a camera. Someone had planted surveillance in her apartment. Claire froze, every nerve on edge. She swept the room, finding 2 more hidden devices. Whoever had placed them there was careful, but not careful enough. She sat down at her desk, breathing hard, and for the first time, fear crept in. She had expected pushback, even threats. But this was different. This was intrusion. A message: "We are watching you." Claire clenched her fists. She thought of the families who had trusted her to tell their story. She thought of Michael Harrington's smug warning at the bar. And she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she couldn't back down now. If Michael wanted a war, she would give him one. The lines were drawn. Michael Harrington, desperate to preserve his empire, was willing to play dirtier than ever before. Claire Donovan, armed with truth and outrage, was prepared to risk everything to expose him. Both knew there could only be one winner. And somewhere in the shadows, Elena Ramirez watched, torn between loyalty to her employer and a gnawing sense that maybe, just maybe, the journalist was right. The following morning, Michael Harrington stood before the mirror in a crisp charcoal suit, rehearsing the performance of his life. The cameras would soon be rolling, and every movement, every smile, had to send the same message: unshakable confidence. He knew the markets followed his expressions as much as his words. A knock came at the door. Julia Marks, his communications director, entered carrying a thick binder. Her eyes were sharp behind her glasses, but there was tension in the way she clutched the folder. "Here's the media plan for today's interview," Julia said. "CNBC wants you to address the rumors about environmental violations. They'll frame it as speculation, but the questions will come." Michael smirked. "Speculation. That's the only word people need to hear. I'll turn it into a witch hunt narrative. Americans love a self-made man being unfairly targeted." Julia hesitated. It could work. But Claire Donovan isn't just another blogger. She releases what she has. Michael cut her off with a raised hand. "She won't. Not if we stay 3 steps ahead." He flipped through the binder, skimming headlines prepared by Julia's team. Visionary entrepreneur faces baseless attacks. Philanthropist Harrington, target of political smear campaign? Silicon Valley titan under siege by radical journalist. Michael chuckled. "Perfect. Let's make her look like a conspiracy theorist chasing shadows. By the time she publishes anything, her reputation will already be in tatters." That afternoon, the CNBC interview aired live. The set was slick and modern, the host deferential but eager for sound bites. "Mr. Harrington," the anchor began, "there have been whispers about your company's role in past environmental issues. What do you say to critics who suggest your empire isn't as clean as it appears?" Michael leaned forward, folding his hands with practiced gravitas. "I say this: America loves to tear down its success stories. I built my company from the ground up, creating jobs, fueling innovation, and giving back through every channel I can. And now I'm being targeted by individuals who thrive on sensationalism. It's disheartening. But I believe in transparency, and I welcome scrutiny because I have nothing to hide." The anchor nodded sympathetically. "So, you're saying this is personal?" Michael gave a rueful smile. "Of course it's personal. It always is. But the truth will win out. It always does." The segment ended with applause from the small studio audience. Social media lit up within minutes, hashtags like #StandWithHarrington and #WitchHunt trending on Twitter. His PR machine had done its job. But Michael knew it was only the opening salvo. Meanwhile, Claire Donovan sat in her apartment, watching the interview on her laptop. Her jaw clenched with every polished word. "He's already turning the narrative," she muttered. "Turning me into the villain before I even publish." She opened her email and scanned the messages pouring in. Half were supportive, activists offering help, whistleblowers hinting at documents. The other half were vicious, threats, insults, accusations that she was a fraud. One email stood out. It was anonymous, sent through an encrypted service. The subject line read, "He knows where you live." Claire swallowed hard. She had expected resistance, but the speed and precision of the backlash rattled her. Still, she forced herself to focus. She couldn't let fear dictate her moves. She grabbed her phone and dialed her editor at the paper, a gruff veteran named Martin Feldman. "Martin, it's happening," she said as soon as he picked up. "He's mobilizing. Media manipulation, online trolls, may be worse. If I go forward, I'll need the paper's full backing." On the other end, Martin sighed heavily. "Claire, you're playing with fire. Harrington has friends in every corner of power. If you publish, you won't just be burning a bridge, you'll be nuking it." "I don't care about bridges," Claire said firmly. "I care about the families he destroyed." There was a long pause. Finally Martin replied, "Then we go all in. But you'd better bring me proof so solid it can't be buried. Otherwise, he'll crush you and us." Back in Manhattan, Michael convened a private meeting with Elena Ramirez. They sat in the dimly lit corner of a cigar lounge, away from prying eyes. "Elena," Michael said, lowering his voice, "I want every angle explored. If she's digging, we bury her before she can plant the seed. Dredge up her past, student loans, broken relationships, anything we can weaponize." Elena studied him carefully. "Michael, she's not corrupt. I've looked. She's clean. You can't smear her the way you smear politicians." Michael's expression hardened. "Then fabricate something. Create the perception of bias. Link her to activist groups, foreign money, whatever it takes." For the first time in years, Elena felt a flicker of unease. There was ruthlessness and then there was desperation. And Michael Harrington, the man who once prided himself on precision, was starting to sound desperate. "Consider it done," she said finally, though the words felt heavy on her tongue. That night, Claire sat at her desk, surrounded by files and photos, exhaustion tugging at her eyelids. But beneath the fatigue was a surge of determination. She had enough to publish a preliminary story, maybe not the whole truth yet, but enough to expose cracks in Harrington's empire. As she drafted her opening paragraph, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She opened it and froze. It was a photo of her, taken that very afternoon as she walked home from the subway. The caption read, "Stop, or next time we won't just be watching." Claire's hands trembled, but then she steadied them on the keyboard. She whispered to herself, "If they're this scared, it means I'm close." And with that she kept typing. By the end of the week, Michael Harrington's media machine was running at full throttle. What had begun as whispers about Claire Donovan had become a full-blown campaign. Blogs, talk shows, even late-night comedians, all were suddenly painting her as an unstable journalist with a personal vendetta. The headlines were brutal. Radical reporter targets America's favorite billionaire. Claire Donovan, investigative journalist or conspiracy theorist? Anonymous sources question reporters' mental health. Claire sat at her desk, scrolling through the avalanche of coverage. Each article cut like glass, twisting her words, framing her as biased, reckless, even dangerous. Her phone rang nonstop, reporters asking for comment, strangers hurling insults, friends urging her to back off for her own safety. She pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting the urge to break down. Then she heard Martin Feldman's gravelly voice in her head. "If you don't control the narrative, they will." Claire opened her laptop and began drafting a rebuttal, a transparent post on her own platform, laying out the evidence she'd gathered so far. Not the full story, but enough to prove she wasn't spinning fantasies. Before she could finish, her phone buzzed with a message from Martin. "Hold off. Meet me at the office." At the newspaper's downtown office, Martin was waiting in his glass-walled office, arms crossed. His expression was grim. "They're coming after us now," he said without preamble. "Harrington's lawyers sent a letter this morning threatening a defamation suit. They claim you're stalking him, harassing his staff, fabricating evidence." Claire's stomach knotted. "That's ridiculous. I haven't fabricated anything." "I know that," Martin said. "But lawsuits aren't about truth, they're about resources. Harrington has an army of lawyers. We don't. Even if we win, he'll bury us in motions until we're broke." Claire paced the room. "So what, we just give up? Let him rewrite the story?" Martin shook his head. "No. But we need more than anecdotes and photos. We need hard proof, financial records, internal memos, something undeniable. Otherwise, this smear campaign will stick, and you'll be finished before you start." Claire clenched her fists. "Then I'll get it. Whatever it takes." Across town, in a sleek conference room on the 48th floor of Harrington Global's headquarters, Michael and his inner circle reviewed their progress. Julia Marks presented a series of charts showing social media sentiment. "The tide is turning. Last week, 70% of mentions were negative. Now it's down to 40%. If we sustain this for another month, Donovan will lose credibility entirely." Michael leaned back, satisfied. "Good. Keep pushing. Make her look obsessed, irrational. If she tries to publish, no one will believe her." But Elena Ramirez remained silent, her eyes fixed on the table. Finally, Michael noticed. "What is it?" he asked. Elena looked up. "You're winning the perception war. But Claire isn't the type to quit. If anything, the pressure will make her more dangerous. She's not chasing clicks. She's chasing justice." Michael's smile was cold. "Justice is a fairy tale, Elena. The world runs on perception. And perception is mine to control." Still, Elena couldn't shake the image of Claire's determined eyes during their coffee shop meeting. For the first time in years, she wondered if she was on the wrong side. That night, Claire met with a source in a dimly lit diner in Queens. The man was in his late 60s, nervous, chain-smoking as he slid a folder across the table. "I worked at one of Harrington's subsidiary plants back in the 90s, he said, his voice trembling. "We were ordered to dump chemical waste into the river. They told us it was safe, but I saw what it did. To the water, to the fish, to people." Claire flipped through the folder. Inside were copies of old memos, shipping logs, even photographs. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't circumstantial. This was direct evidence of illegal activity. "Why now?" Claire asked softly. The man stubbed out his cigarette, eyes glassy. "Because my grandson's sick. Same illness I saw in the kids back then. I can't stay quiet anymore. Claire's throat tightened. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Thank you. I promise I'll make this count. As Claire left the diner, she felt a surge of hope, but it was short-lived. She noticed a black SUV parked across the street, engine idling, headlights dim. Her instinct screamed. She quickened her pace, ducking into a side street. The SUV followed. Heart pounding, she darted through a narrow alley and into the crowded subway entrance. Only when the train doors closed behind her did she allow herself to breathe again. Claire clutched the folder to her chest. She had what she needed to fight back. But she also knew the stakes had just escalated. Michael Harrington wasn't just trying to discredit her anymore. He was trying to silence her, for good. Claire Donovan didn't sleep that night. The folder lay open across her desk, its damning documents illuminated by the glow of her desk lamp. Every page screamed of negligence and corruption. Memos signed by mid-level managers, expense reports masking disposal costs, photographs of dumping sites. Together they painted a picture too stark to ignore. But Claire knew evidence alone wasn't enough. Harrington's smear campaign had already poisoned public opinion. If she wanted the truth to stick, she needed allies, people with credibility, reach, and influence to amplify her voice when the time came. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she landed on one. Dr. Olivia Chin, an environmental scientist who had testified in several high-profile contamination cases. Claire dialed, hoping the late hour wouldn't matter. Claire? Olivia's voice was groggy but alert. What's going on? I've got something big, Claire said. Evidence tying Harrington Global to illegal dumping. I need your expertise to verify it, and maybe your voice to back it up when I publish. There was a pause. Then Olivia replied, send me what you have. But be careful, Claire. If you're right, you're poking a hornet's nest. I already did, Claire whispered. And they're stinging. Meanwhile, in Harrington's penthouse suite, Michael Harrington poured himself a glass of scotch, savoring the smoky burn as he stared out over the glittering Manhattan skyline. The smear campaign had shifted public sentiment, but he wasn't blind. He knew Claire was still out there, gathering evidence. Elena, he said without turning, give me an update. Elena Ramirez, arms folded, stood a few feet away. She met with a former employee tonight. We don't know what was exchanged, but my guess is documents. Michael's jaw tightened. Then take care of it. Elena hesitated. Michael, we've crossed the line already. Surveillance, intimidation, media attacks. If we push harder, we risk exposure ourselves. Even your allies in Washington won't be able to cover that up forever. Michael turned sharply, his eyes hard as steel. Exposure is only a risk if we fail. And failure is not an option. Do you understand? Elena nodded, but inside, doubt gnawed at her. Once, she had believed she was protecting a visionary leader. Now, she wasn't sure if she was just protecting a criminal. The next morning, Claire arrived at Olivia Chen's university lab, clutching the folder like a lifeline. Olivia, a petite woman with sharp eyes, spread the documents across a stainless steel table. These are serious, Olivia said, scanning the memos. If authentic, they're enough to trigger a federal investigation. But authenticity is the key. Harrington's lawyers will argue these are forgeries unless we can verify them. I figured as much, Claire said. Can you help? Olivia nodded. Yes. But we'll need corroboration. Lab results, corroborating testimonies, maybe whistleblowers willing to go on record. This can't just be paper. It has to be airtight. Claire exhaled, feeling both relief and the weight of a longer road ahead. Then let's start building the case. That afternoon, Michael launched his next move. An exposé appeared on a fringe but widely shared news site. Journalist Claire Donovan linked to radical eco-terrorist groups. The article featured grainy photos of Claire at environmental rallies, twisted to suggest she was secretly aligned with extremists. Within hours, mainstream outlets picked it up. Claire read the piece with mounting fury. This is insane, she snapped, slamming her laptop shut. I covered those rallies as a reporter. They're twisting everything. Martin called within minutes. I told you this would happen. They're trying to brand you as biased. You need to be ready to counter it fast. I'll counter with the truth, Claire said. But I need more. Olivia's helping me verify the documents, but we need testimonies. Martin sighed. I'll see who I can connect you with. But Claire, watch your back. They're not playing fair. Later that evening, Claire met with Olivia again. Together, they outlined a plan. Approach former employees, gather sworn statements, run lab tests on water samples near the old plant. Every step would bring them closer to a bulletproof case. But as Claire left the lab she felt it again, the prickle of eyes on her. A man stood across the street, pretending to check his phone, but his gaze lingered too long. When she quickened her pace he followed. Claire ducked into a crowded bookstore, weaving between aisles until she slipped out a side exit. Her pulse thundered in her ears. They were closing in and she knew it. Across the city, Elena sat alone in her apartment, staring at the surveillance report on Claire's movements. Something in her chest twisted. She had followed orders her entire career, but something about Claire's resolve, her willingness to risk everything for strangers, struck a chord. Elena picked up her phone, hesitated, then began typing a message on a secure line. "You're in danger. Watch who you trust." She stared at the screen, thumb hovering over send. If she pressed it, she'd betray Michael Harrington, the man who had given her everything. But if she didn't, she might watch an innocent woman be destroyed. The phone buzzed suddenly, a message from Michael himself. "Call me. We need to accelerate." Elena's stomach dropped. The walls were closing in, for all of them. The night air was crisp when Daniel stepped out of the gala. The laughter and applause still echoed behind him, muffled through the glass doors of the skyscraper ballroom. He had given a speech minutes earlier, one of those carefully polished addresses about resilience and innovation. Cameras had flashed, investors had smiled, and the press had scribbled in their notebooks. On the surface he looked like a man standing at the peak of power. But the moment he was outside, the mask began to slip. Daniel loosened his tie and leaned against the cold stone of the building. His phone buzzed in his pocket, no doubt a flood of congratulations, requests, and maybe even praise from Washington. Yet none of it mattered. All he could hear was Emma's voice echoing in his head. "You need to decide who you are, Daniel, before it's too late." For the first time in years he felt something rare, hesitation. He had built his empire on precision, never second-guessing himself, never allowing doubt to creep in. But now, every decision felt like a fracture waiting to split the entire structure apart. He knew the truth about the contracts. He knew the shortcuts taken to secure his company's dominance. And he knew, with the kind of certainty that gnawed at the soul, that if those truths were revealed, his empire would burn. A black sedan pulled up at the curb. Victor stepped out, dressed immaculately as always. His smile was calm, almost reassuring, but Daniel recognized the steel in his eyes. Victor wasn't here to congratulate him. "You slipped out early," Victor said, adjusting his cufflinks as he walked closer. "Not like you to leave the spotlight behind." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I needed air." Victor chuckled. "Air? Or distance? You've been distracted lately." There was the test. Victor had always been a man who thrived on control, the kind of advisor who blurred the line between loyalty and ownership. He had stood beside Daniel during the meteoric rise, managing crises, silencing critics, and ensuring every stumble disappeared before it could become a story. But loyalty to Victor came with strings. And Daniel was beginning to feel them tightening like a noose. "Emma's been calling," Victor continued, his tone smooth but edged. "She's a distraction you can't afford right now." Daniel's jaw tightened. He hated how Victor said her name as if she were a pawn on his chessboard. "She's not the enemy," Daniel said quietly. Victor's smile thinned. "No, but she could become one if you're not careful. Journalists smell blood, Daniel. They're circling. And if Emma feeds them even a hint of what she knows..." He let the sentence trail off, the implication heavy in the silence. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. The city pulsed around them. Taxis honking, neon lights flickering, strangers moving with hurried purpose. And yet, in that instant, Daniel felt utterly isolated. He thought of his father working double shifts at the steel mill. He thought of the sacrifices, the relentless hunger that had driven him to seize every opportunity, no matter the cost. But he also thought of Emma, of the nights when they were young and broke, dreaming together of a future not defined by power but by purpose. Somewhere along the line he had lost that version of himself. Victor leaned closer, lowering his voice. "We've come too far for you to start doubting now. You built this empire, Daniel, but don't forget, I helped you keep it standing. You can't afford morality. Not now. Not ever." The words landed like shackles. Daniel forced himself to meet Victor's gaze. "And what if morality is all I have left?" Victor's expression hardened. The silence between them was sharp, dangerous. Then, with a controlled smile, Victor placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Careful, my friend. You don't want to find out what it costs to ask that question." As Victor returned to the car, Daniel remained rooted to the spot. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, his hands clenched tight at his sides. He knew he was standing at the edge of something irreversible. One step toward Victor's world and he would bury his conscience for good. One step away and everything he had built could collapse in flames. The sedan pulled away, its red taillights glowing like embers in the distance. Daniel stayed there long after it disappeared, staring at the skyline he had once dreamed of conquering. The glittering towers no longer looked like monuments of triumph. They looked like prisons of glass and steel. When his phone buzzed again, he didn't check the screen. He knew it was Emma. And for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of answering. The following morning, Daniel sat in his office atop the glass tower that bore his company's name. The city stretched endlessly below, a sprawl of ambition and hunger, but for the first time the view filled him with dread instead of pride. His reflection in the window was ghost-like, dark circles under his eyes, a jaw clenched too tightly, a man who looked far older than his years. A knock at the door broke the silence. His assistant, Melissa, slipped inside, her face pale. "Mr. Carter, you need to see this." She handed him a tablet, her hand trembling slightly. The headline blazed across the screen. "Whispers of corruption inside Carter Industries. Anonymous sources speak out." Beneath the headline was a grainy photo of Daniel shaking hands with a senator. The article didn't have hard evidence yet, but the implications were damning: backroom deals, regulatory favors, quiet payouts. And worse, it promised more revelations coming soon. Daniel's stomach sank. He knew exactly who the anonymous sources could be. Emma hadn't wasted time. Or maybe she hadn't spoken to anyone at all, and the vultures had simply caught the scent on their own. Either way, the storm had begun. Before he could process, the door opened again. This time it was Victor, walking in without knocking, his presence sharp and commanding as ever. "Well," Victor said, tossing a folded newspaper onto the desk beside the tablet. "We've got ourselves a problem." Daniel clenched his fists. "You knew this was coming." Victor smirked, though his eyes were cold. "Of course I did. The higher you climb, the more the world wants to drag you down. But you're forgetting one thing, Daniel. We hold the cards. These stories don't exist if we decide they don't." "Meaning what?" Daniel asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Meaning," Victor said smoothly, lowering his voice, "we find the leak, we silence it, and we remind the press who really pays their bills. A donation here, a lawsuit there, business as usual." Daniel's chest tightened. He thought of Emma's words at the pier: "You already lost it. You just don't see it yet." If he followed Victor's path again, it would mean burying the truth deeper, shackling himself tighter to the very corruption that had brought him here. "What if we don't silence it?" Daniel asked quietly. "What if we face it?" Victor's expression froze. Then, with deliberate calm, he leaned against the desk, his shadow falling over Daniel. "Listen to me. Empires don't survive on honesty. They survive on control. You tell the truth, Daniel, and everything burns: your legacy, your wealth, your influence. And when the flames die down, do you know what's left? Nothing. Not even your name." For a moment, Daniel almost believed him. But then Melissa's voice broke the tension. "Sir," she said, her tone shaky, "the media's calling non-stop. And your board wants an emergency meeting this afternoon." Victor straightened, smoothing his tie. "Good. We'll handle it. We'll remind them why they invested in you in the first place. They want a leader who fights, not a man who caves." Daniel rose from his chair, feeling the ground shift beneath him. His empire, his carefully constructed fortress of steel and glass, was cracking. He thought of the workers, the families whose lives were touched, sometimes ruined, by the decisions made in this very office. He thought of Emma standing under the dim streetlight, daring him to be the man he once was. "I need time to think," Daniel said, his voice firmer than he expected. Victor's eyes narrowed. "Time is the one luxury you don't have. Decide now. Are you going to be the man who built an empire or the man who destroyed it?" The question hung in the air long after Victor left the office. Hours later, Daniel found himself in the boardroom facing a dozen anxious investors. The atmosphere was electric with fear and anger. Charts and projections glowed on screens, but no one was looking at them. They were looking at him. "Mr. Carter," one of the older board members began, his voice clipped, "we've stood by you through market crashes, lawsuits, and controversies. But this," he tapped the newspaper on the table, "this is different. If there's truth in these allegations, we could lose everything." Murmurs of agreement filled the room. Daniel felt their eyes digging into him, demanding reassurance, demanding strength. His instinct screamed to deliver the speech they expected, the practiced denial, the confident dismissal of rumors. But the words caught in his throat. Finally he spoke. I won't lie to you. Mistakes were made. Deals were struck that never should have been. And if these truths come out, we'll face consequences. The room erupted. Some shouted in outrage, others whispered furiously to one another. Victor, seated at the far end, leaned back with a smirk that looked dangerously close to a threat. Are you admitting guilt? One board member snapped. Daniel's voice shook, but he didn't falter. I'm admitting that we can't build a future on lies. Not anymore. The chaos swelled around him, but Daniel felt strangely lighter, as though a burden had shifted even if only slightly. The walls were closing in, yes, but perhaps beyond them there was a chance to step into the light. Daniel's thumb hovered over the glowing phone screen. Emma calling. Her name pulsed like a beacon, urging him toward a truth he had avoided for years. The sounds of the city blurred, the horns, the chatter, even the hum of the skyscraper's lights. It was just him, the phone, and the weight of a decision. Finally he answered. Daniel? Her voice carried a tremor, one he recognized immediately. It was the same tremor she'd had when she'd stood with him at the courthouse steps years ago, defending him against a swarm of reporters who doubted he'd ever succeed. Back then that tremor meant fear mixed with hope. Tonight it meant urgency. I'm here, Daniel said quietly, his throat dry. Good, she exhaled. Because we need to talk. Face to face. No more dodging. Daniel's instinct was to resist, to retreat into the fortress he had built for himself. A fortress of lawyers, PR teams, and people like Victor who always had answers. But Emma's tone left no room for escape. Where? He asked. Pier 47. Midnight. No one will be there. Just us. The line went dead. By the time Daniel arrived at the pier, the city's chaos had given way to silence. The water lapped softly against wooden posts, carrying with it the briny scent of the Hudson. A thin mist clung to the air, blurring the edges of the skyline across the river. Emma was already there, standing beneath a flickering streetlight. She wore a simple coat, her hair pulled back, nothing like the glamorous evenings of their past. She looked smaller than he remembered, but her eyes, sharp, unyielding, were the same. For a moment, Daniel hesitated. Seeing her like this pulled him backward in time, to the nights they spent in cramped apartments, dreaming big dreams and promising each other they'd never lose themselves to power. He swallowed hard and walked toward her. You came, Emma said, her voice firm, though her hands trembled slightly. You didn't leave me much choice, Daniel replied, managing a thin smile. She ignored the attempt at levity. You're in trouble, Daniel. And I don't mean the kind you can buy your way out of. These deals, these contracts, you know what they've cost people. Her words cut deeper than any headline or investigation ever could. Coming from Emma, they carried the weight of betrayal and love intertwined. I did what I had to, Daniel said, his tone defensive but softer than usual. To survive. To build something. You know where I came from, Emma. I wasn't going to let myself end up like my father, broken, forgotten. Emma stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. And what have you become instead? A man who measures worth in dollars and silence? Is that who you wanted to be when we were 22 and planning a life we couldn't afford? Her words clawed at him. He wanted to argue, to insist that the empire was for them, for the family they'd once talked about, for the security they never had. But that excuse had long expired. You think I don't know the cost? Daniel whispered. His voice cracked, surprising even himself. Every night I close my eyes and I see them. The workers who lost their homes, the communities gutted by our expansions, the politicians whose pockets we filled just to get one more permit signed. I know exactly what it's cost, Emma. I just don't know how to stop it. For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft slap of water against the pier. Emma's face softened, but only slightly. You stop it by telling the truth, she said. Not to me. Not just to yourself. To the world. You have the power to expose Victor, to clean the rot out before it consumes everything. Daniel shook his head, his chest tightening. And lose everything I built? Everything my father worked for, everything we dreamed about? Emma's eyes glistened, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Daniel, you already lost it. You just don't see it yet. The words landed like a blow. He turned away, staring at the black water stretching endlessly ahead. He had always believed the empire was the answer, that as long as he kept building, kept winning, he could outrun the shadows of his past. But here, under the dim glow of the streetlight, he realized Emma was right. The empire wasn't protecting him anymore. It was consuming him. He turned back, meeting her gaze. And if I do this, if I go public, if I tear it all down, what then? What's left? Emma took a step forward, close enough that he could see the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes. What's left is you. The man I once believed in. Maybe the world needs him more than it needs another billionaire. The night seemed to still, the city itself holding its breath. Daniel felt the pull of two worlds, Victor's, built on secrets and power, and Emma's, anchored in truth and sacrifice. For the first time in years he felt the weight of the choice fully pressing down on him. He didn't answer her, not yet. But deep inside something shifted. The boardroom emptied like a battlefield after defeat, papers scattered, voices raised, alliances shattered. Some stormed out in fury, others lingered to whisper among themselves. Only Daniel remained seated at the head of the long oak table, staring at the city lights outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. For years that view had symbolized triumph. Tonight, it looked like a jury of millions waiting to deliver its verdict. Victor lingered too, arms folded, his expression unreadable. Finally he stepped closer, his polished shoes tapping lightly against the floor. That, Victor said, his voice low and controlled, was the single most reckless thing you've ever done. Daniel looked up. It was the truth. Victor's lips curved into something between a smile and a sneer. Truth is a luxury for men who have nothing to lose. You just set fire to billions. Do you know how many knives are about to turn against you? Daniel exhaled, leaning back in his chair. Let them. Maybe it's time. Victor leaned down, placing both hands on the table. His eyes were sharp, dangerous. Don't mistake this for courage. This is suicide. You think Emma will save you? You think honesty will win over the vultures out there? No. They'll eat you alive. And when they're finished, I'll still be standing. For the first time, Daniel saw Victor clearly, not as the advisor who had carried him through storms, but as the man who had chained him to corruption. Victor wasn't afraid of losing. He was afraid of Daniel choosing freedom. I don't need you anymore, Daniel said quietly. Victor's smile vanished. He straightened, his jaw tightening. Careful, Daniel. Men who cut me loose don't last long. He left the boardroom without another word, but the threat lingered like smoke in Daniel's lungs. That night, Daniel returned home to his penthouse. The silence was oppressive. For years, his home had been filled with people. Assistants, chefs, security, even friends who came to bask in his wealth. But tonight, it felt cavernous, hollow, every echo a reminder of how empty the empire had become. On the kitchen counter sat a letter. Not typed. Not emailed. Handwritten the way Emma used to leave notes in the early years. Daniel unfolded it with trembling fingers. If you're serious about change, you can't do this alone. Tomorrow, I'll be at the old library on 12th Street. Meet me there. But understand this, Daniel. If you come, there's no turning back. He read it 3 times, his chest tightening. She was offering him a way out, a path to redemption, but one paved with exposure, sacrifice, maybe ruin. For hours he walked the length of the penthouse, his mind waging war. Every instinct screamed to protect what he had left. The company, the reputation, the control. But beneath that instinct, a quieter voice, Emma's voice, urged him to remember the man he once was. As dawn crept through the windows, painting the skyline in pale gold, Daniel made his choice. By the time he reached the library the next morning, the air was thick with tension. The building was abandoned, its windows boarded, its stone steps cracked with age. Yet Emma stood at the entrance, a coffee in her hands, her posture tense but expectant. You came, she said softly. Daniel nodded. I meant what I said. I can't keep lying. Emma studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether she could finally believe him. Then she handed him a folder. This is what I've gathered. Contracts, emails, payment records. Enough to prove what Victor and his partners have been hiding for years. Daniel opened the folder. The papers inside were damning, evidence that could topple not just his empire but powerful allies in politics and finance. His hands shook as he flipped through the pages. This will destroy me, he said. Emma's gaze didn't waver. Maybe. Or maybe it will free you. But you need to understand, Daniel, Victor won't let this happen quietly. He'll come for you. Almost on cue his phone buzzed. A single text from an unknown number. You've made your choice. Now you'll pay the price. Daniel showed it to Emma. She closed her eyes briefly, then looked at him with grim resolve. It's begun. For a moment, fear clawed at Daniel's chest. But alongside it came something else, clarity. For years he had built walls to keep the world at bay, but those walls had become his prison. Now, facing Victor's retaliation, he felt strangely lighter. I'm not running anymore, he said. Emma nodded. Then we fight. As they left the library together, Daniel knew the days ahead would test him more than anything before. His empire was crumbling, his enemies closing in, and Victor's shadow loomed larger than ever. But for the first time in years, Daniel was walking toward something real. Not power, not wealth, but truth. And that, he realized, terrified him most of all. The following morning was heavy with anticipation. The hotel lobby bustled with guests checking out, staff hurrying with trays of coffee, and the faint scent of fresh pastries drifting from the breakfast area. Yet for David and Emma, none of it registered. Their entire focus was locked on the slim leather envelope resting on the marble table between them, the one Mr. Harrison had promised would contain the documents to unmask the fraud. Emma reached for it, her hands trembling ever so slightly. "Do you think it's really everything he said?" she whispered. David's eyes, sharp and restless, flicked to the envelope. "It has to be. He wouldn't risk so much unless he was certain. But we'll need to be cautious. If anyone sees us with it, we could be in danger." Before they could open it, Mr. Harrison himself appeared, moving swiftly through the lobby. His eyes darted nervously, scanning every corner. He wore a charcoal suit, but his posture betrayed tension. He stopped abruptly at their table and leaned down. "Take it," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "Inside you'll find contracts, falsified signatures, offshore account details. Enough to tear their empire down." David glanced around. "Why the rush?" Harrison's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because they know. I was followed here. You don't have much time. Don't contact me again." And with that, he turned and disappeared into the revolving door, leaving them frozen in place. Emma clutched David's arm. He was terrified. "Did you see his face?" David nodded grimly. "Which means we're running out of time too." They rose from the table and carried the envelope upstairs to their room. Once inside, David locked the door and drew the curtains. The air felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Slowly, Emma slid her finger under the seal and pulled out the documents. Page after page revealed a tangled web of deception. Forged contracts awarding construction rights to shell companies, fraudulent signatures of city officials, wire transfers funneled into anonymous accounts in the Cayman Islands. Each page confirmed the corruption was far deeper than they had imagined. Emma's voice broke the silence. "David, this isn't just about one company. Look, politicians, lawyers, even regulators. They're all involved." David ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening. "This is bigger than we thought. If we expose this, we're not just taking down a corporation. We're dismantling a network that's been feeding on the city for decades." Suddenly there was a faint knock at the door. Both froze. Emma whispered, "Housekeeping?" David shook his head. Housekeeping didn't knock like that. 3 quick raps, deliberate and sharp. He motioned for Emma to stay back, then approached quietly. Without opening, he pressed his ear against the door. Silence. Then another knock. Louder this time. Emma's heart pounded. "What do we do?" David quickly gathered the papers and slid them back into the envelope. "We can't stay here. If they know Harrison gave us this, they'll come after us next." He crossed to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peer outside. On the street below, a black sedan idled by the curb, its windows tinted dark. A man in a dark coat leaned casually against the lamppost, smoking, but his gaze never left the hotel entrance. "They're already here," David muttered. Emma's face paled. "Then how do we get out?" David's mind raced. "We need to split. They'll expect us to leave together. If one of us gets caught, the other must make it out with the evidence." Emma shook her head fiercely. "No. We stay together. We started this together, we finish it together." Their argument was cut short by the sound of a keycard sliding into the lock. The doorknob twisted. Without hesitation, David grabbed Emma's hand and yanked her toward the balcony. They slipped outside just as the door creaked open behind them. A shadow filled the doorway, followed by the heavy tread of footsteps. On the balcony, David scanned quickly. They were on the 4th floor. Below them, a narrow alley ran between the hotel and an old brick building. Emma's voice trembled. "We can't jump from here." David's eyes darted upward. A fire escape zigzagged down the side of the adjacent building, just a few feet out of reach. Not down, up. Clutching the envelope, he helped Emma climb onto the railing. She reached for the iron bars of the fire escape ladder, her fingers barely catching hold. With a grunt, she pulled herself up. David followed, his muscles straining as he hauled himself across. Behind them, the hotel door burst open, and a man's voice shouted in anger. They scrambled up the fire escape as footsteps thundered into the room they had just vacated. A bullet shattered the balcony railing, sending splinters flying. Emma gasped but kept climbing. At the rooftop they collapsed, breathless and trembling. The city stretched before them, glittering lights, honking horns, life moving on, unaware of the peril unfolding above. David clutched the envelope to his chest. We can't go back. From this moment on, we're fugitives. Emma wiped sweat from her brow, her eyes blazing with determination. Then we run. We run until we find the right moment to strike. And when we do, the world will finally see the truth. Somewhere in the shadows, their enemies were already regrouping. But for the first time, David and Emma felt the power shift. They weren't just victims anymore, they were holding the weapon that could bring the entire corrupt empire crashing down. And they weren't about to let go. The rooftop air was sharp and cold, whipping against their faces as dawn stretched across the horizon. David and Emma crouched behind a rusted ventilation unit, their breath coming in ragged bursts. In David's hands, the envelope felt less like paper and more like a live weapon, something powerful enough to alter the balance of an entire city, or to destroy them if it slipped into the wrong hands. Emma looked at him, her face streaked with grime but her eyes steady. We can't keep running forever. We need to use this, now. Before they erase everything. David nodded, his mind racing. We need someone outside their reach. A journalist who can't be bought, someone who'll publish this no matter the risk. Emma thought for a moment, then said, what about Sarah Collins? She's been investigating corporate fraud for years. She's fearless and she's not tied to any of them. David's expression hardened with resolve. Then Sarah it is. But even as he spoke, the sound of footsteps echoed from the fire escape below. The men in dark coats were closing in. We don't have time, Emma whispered. David glanced around the rooftop, spotting a narrow service ladder that led down to the street behind the building. He tugged Emma toward it, and together they climbed down, the metal rungs icy under their palms. At the bottom, they slipped into the early morning crowd, joggers, street vendors setting up carts, commuters with tired faces. For a moment it almost felt normal. Almost. Behind them, a black sedan screeched around the corner. David pulled Emma into a side alley, heart hammering. We split up here. I'll draw them off. You get the envelope to Sarah. Emma shook her head fiercely. No. If they catch you. Listen to me. David's voice was urgent. They're expecting us together. If we both run, they'll divide their forces. That gives us a chance. Emma's eyes welled with fear, but she knew he was right. With a trembling hand, he pressed the envelope into her arms. Keep moving. Don't stop for anything. Then, before she could protest again, he sprinted into the open street, drawing the sedan's attention. Tires squealed as the car swerved toward him. Emma swallowed hard, forced her feet into motion, and disappeared into the maze of alleys. Hours later, Emma sat in the corner of a quiet cafe, a hood pulled low over her face. Across from her, Sarah Collins arrived, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, a recorder always in her pocket, and the aura of someone who had stared danger in the face too many times to count. You said it was urgent, Sarah murmured, her gaze scanning the room. Let me see. Emma slid the envelope across the table, her hands still trembling. Sarah opened it carefully, her eyes widening as she flipped through the documents. My God. This isn't just a scandal. This is a whole machine. Politicians, regulators, corporations, they're all in on it. Emma leaned forward, her voice low. If you publish it, they'll come after you too. Sarah smirked faintly. They've tried before. They never win. For the first time in hours, Emma felt hope flicker in her chest. Meanwhile, David wasn't as lucky. He had managed to lose the sedan for a time, ducking through construction sites and weaving through crowds. But by nightfall he was cornered in an abandoned warehouse near the docks. The leader of the men in coats stepped forward, his face cold, eyes flat. Where are the papers, David? David stood tall despite his exhaustion. Gone. Already in the right hands. The man's jaw tightened. You've made a mistake. Do you know who we are? David almost laughed. Yes. And soon everyone else will too. The man's face darkened and he raised a gun. But before he could fire, the distant wail of police sirens cut through the night. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Clearly their network's protection no longer guaranteed. In the confusion, David bolted through a side door, running toward the flashing blue lights. 2 days later, the headlines exploded. Sarah Collins had released everything. Scanned contracts, bank statements, emails, signatures. The story spread like wildfire, across newspapers, television, and social media. Corruption web exposed, politicians and corporate giants named. Protests erupted in the streets. Officials were forced to resign. Arrests followed. The city buzzed with outrage but also with hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the tide was finally turning. David and Emma watched it unfold from a safe apartment, their faces pale but relieved. Emma turned to him. "We did it. It's out there. They can't hide anymore." David gave a weary smile. "We did. But it's not over. They'll rebuild, try again. People like them always do. The question is whether the rest of us are willing to fight back." Emma slipped her hand into his. "Then we'll be ready." For the first time since their ordeal began, they allowed themselves a moment of peace. The city outside was noisy, chaotic, uncertain, but also alive, pulsing with the power of truth finally brought into the light. And for David and Emma that was enough.